the topic of today's discussion is B2B media, how to run a successful B2B media company. This is something that obviously is near and dear to my heart, since I consider my newsletter and podcast to be B2B towards the media industry and the creator economy. Obviously, I don't know, I'm sure most of you like 10, 12 years ago would stumble across some of these B2B trade publications and stuff like that, and they look like they had websites that were from like the mid 1990s. It was like the least innovative sector within media. But within the last, 5 to 10 years or so, we've seen some really cool public niche publications launching, things like Industry Jive, Sports Pro Media, lots of different companies that are not only digital first, but are really kind of really innovative on the monetization side when it comes to things like native advertising, subscriptions, events, things like that. So, and it's one of the most exciting kind of growth areas within media. And I think a lot of B2C publishers now are looking towards the B2B side for ideas for, ways that they can innovate, especially on the monetization side. So we got a lot of great speakers on here. I recruited a few to participate. One is Nick Meacham. I might be pronouncing this wrong. He runs a B2B sports media company in the UK. We have Nick Carlson on here. He's a consultant who works with a lot of B2B publishers. We have Matt Brown. He runs an excellent newsletter dedicated to the business of college sports. We have Ari Lewis, who runs a newsletter about the business of space, launched within the last year or two. And we have Joachim Eekhout. He runs a trade publication about biotech. And then we also have lots of other B2B expertise on this call as well. So I really hope that other people, not just those people I just named, will speak up and offer their expertise. Okay, let's jump into it. And I want to call on Nick Meacham first. And Nick, let me know if I'm mispronouncing your last name. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself. First, kind of tell us, just give us a brief overview of who you are and what your company is. But my first question I want to throw out is whether my thesis is true. Like, are we actually experiencing a B2B media renaissance?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Nick Meacham. I'm based in London, though the accent is a bit messy because I'm Australian, actually. I've been over here for 13 years, running Sports Pro at Sports for about 12 of them. And we started as a print publisher, monthly magazine, realized pretty early on when I joined the company that print wasn't enough to build a burgeoning B2B business, and shifted pretty quickly into working out how to expand that. And that was really into the events space was our primary revenue driver, though digital was absolutely the heart and center of our growth, but not from a monetization standpoint, more just the audience standpoint. And over the last 10 years, we've been building an events portfolio. We have something between, I think, in a given year, about 6 conferences in person in 5 countries, run virtual webinars and conferences every other month online. And still our events part of our business is our core revenue driver, although we do generate a lot of revenue now through our digital platforms, through native advertising, sponsored content, that sort of stuff. We have shut down our magazine this year, mainly from an opportunity cost perspective. We were monetizing that, but the amount of time and resource it was taking to produce the magazine, we did the math and realized we were spending a lot of internal resource on that, when that could turn into a lot more value for us from a content perspective. So that is the whirlwind, but feel free to dissect it, Simon, however you see fit.
Yeah, so it's interesting that, like, the print was no longer something that you felt like you really needed. Some publishers argue that print is a good branding exercise, even if it's not itself profitable. But you found that not to be the case, and it just really wasn't worth the cost.
Yeah, I mean, the way we see it now is kind of the digital plays that role for us. So what I mean by that is we're not generating significant amount of revenue from traditional advertising. It's through native stuff, it's through advertorial, it's through podcasts, sponsorship, and so forth. But our audience through digital is pretty significant from a B2B perspective. We generate about 400,000 users on our website every month. So we're generating pretty good numbers, but it's not significant enough to drive advertising revenue at scale. So monetizing that through traditional means wouldn't be significant enough. So we still see that as the sort of the top of the sales and marketing funnel, is that first touch point for us. But still, the events is where we make our bread and butter. Almost to my I don't really want that to be the case, but it's the reality is how things have played out, because the subsectors within sports, you look at sports business as a whole, but then you split up the broadcast sector, sponsorship sector, marketing, and so forth. And we look at those each verticals and subsets and what we can do to monetize them through sponsorship and through pretty traditional events related commercialization and providing events that service those micro, I don't want to call them micro, but sort of specific sectors within the wider sports biz. And that's what's worked for us in driving our business over the last few years. But in terms of traditional advertising, programmatic, we did the sums and it was going to be pretty marginal for us to spend a lot of time and effort into creating that. So we haven't really done it. We are looking to do it eventually. Now we have more resource to get it up and running, but the return it would drive for us is less than a couple of our traditional digital sort of sponsorship deals. So it's not really beneficial for us to spend time doing that. We are looking to launch a subscription product digitally in the coming months. But even so, that we're not expecting a lot for us from a transformative perspective. If it does, great. But the priority is still, for better or worse, still our events business is driving a lot of our revenues through both delegates and through sponsorships.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk a little bit about sponsorship or advertising a little bit down the line. And you're saying what I've heard is that a lot of B2B publishers don't bother with programmatic advertising because they just don't, because it's so niche, they don't have the scale to really make it worth that while. And programmatic, it's kind of failed to really deliver those, like, supposedly the promise was that there'd be this super high CPM if you could get like a really high value consumer, but it never really materialized for most publishers. So let's go back to my original thesis, Nick, of like the B2B media renaissance. You've been following this space for a while. How do you feel like the landscape is for B2B publishers versus B2C publishers?
Yeah, well, the main thing I think that's changed is rewinding 10 years ago, when you would talk to a potential client, you would have to educate them on the value of marketing and advertising and actually spending money to market their B2B business in this space. And now you don't have to do that nearly as much. So what we used to find is that we'd have to do that bit and we might get 50% at best to be interested. Hey, we might do something. They had no budget committed to it, to allocate it into it. So you would have to get through that first hurdle before they then determine it's worth the investment to go with you. That first bit is now not really a hurdle for us. It's now straight to, why do you stand out versus your competitors? Which changes the whole dynamic of the sales approach, right? You can just focus on what you do well and double down on that. So that has really been the big shift. Now the clients we talk to straight into, we can talk very openly about budgets, we can talk about the activations they can do, and we can get straight to the nitty gritty. But 10 years ago, you'd have to spend most of your time just educating why they would need to spend any money on marketing in the first place. Most B2B are like, we just lean on relationships, word of mouth, that's all we need. I used to get this in the UK all the time, is it looks negative to be spending money marketing yourself because you look like you're struggling as a business, which used to be like, well, I found pretty stupid, but that's what we used to hear sometimes. So that whole mindset has really shifted. Now I think businesses in the B2B space get it much more so, and they are investing a lot more into it. And that really helps spur those conversations on. So yeah, the amounts we're charging has been going up significantly through the pandemic. We shifted our events to virtual. We actually grew our business through the pandemic. We doubled in size over the last couple of years. So we were able to charge the same for our virtual events as we would in person. We just deliver bigger audiences. So yeah, in many ways, I think it's never been a better time in this space. You just have to know what sectors you're targeting. You can't just look at it as a whole. We definitely had to splice and dice it up to work out where those opportunities really were. And they weren't across the whole industry. Really, we make revenue out of about 2 or 3 key buckets in sports, and they drive the rest of the business, even though the other areas that we cover aren't necessarily as fruitful. We still find them important to be covering from an editorial standpoint.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I want to touch more on that, like why all of a sudden B2B companies are like really waking up to media and advertising and marketing and stuff like that. Tanya, you had a question that you put into the chat. You want to unmute yourself and chime in?
Yeah, I'll hop on video shortly, but thanks so much for putting this together. I'm Tanya Mushi. I have a consulting company kind of turning to creator, more B2B media, but I've been in B2B for a very long time. And yeah, I'm interested in just knowing, without really knowing someone in an organization, I have zero idea of budget that's dedicated to B2B marketing. So I just wanted some insight, see if anybody here, has either a resource or a particular best practice that we can use.
Yeah, I'll throw that to Nick, and then maybe Ari too could maybe speak to it a little bit since he's been working on a lot on the sales side.
In short, when we were talking to him, we'd have to just ask the question, how much are you spending across your entire strategy and entire year, and see if they'd be willing to give us a sense of that. It was so varied. We'd be talking to companies that are 9-figure turnover and they'd spend next to nothing, and others that 9 figures, they'd be spending tens of millions on marketing. So you have to ask the question, we always find, otherwise you'd have no idea what you were playing with. And that's all we would rely on, is just asking that question to people when we're talking to them.
And correct me if I'm wrong, and Ari, you can maybe speak to this too, is like a lot of B2B companies, they have a much larger lead cycle, but then more expensive products. So like their depending on what it is, it could cost, they could make $200,000 on a single customer, but it takes 6 months to bring that customer in. So to kind of speak to Tanya's point, or what Tanya was asking, is like educating them about, sure, like it might cost a few $1,000s, but if you get 2 or 3 clients out of this, or 2 or 3 leads, like that could be, millions of dollars, versus B2C where they're just literally trying to, sell $2 bottles of Coke or something like that. So, you got to think about that way. Ari, what are your thoughts in terms of, like, you work with the space industry, which I'm guessing has huge lead times and multi-million-dollar contracts and stuff like that. How are you talking to potential B2B advertisers about budget, and how are you thinking around that?
Hi everyone, and yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak, Simon. By the way, I'm at CES, so I'm in a hotel room. So if there's any connection issues, let me know. And if anyone's here, let me say hi. Yeah, I mean, it's super cliche, but like we'll start with just like, I feel like this is sales 101, but like don't pitch the product, like talk to them about like what their marketing strategy is, what their problems are, understanding what they're trying to achieve. One of the questions that we'll ask with a client is like, hey, okay, we're running this campaign. Like, what does success look like? What does renewal look like for you all? Like, what needs to happen for you to renew for another campaign? I think one of both the opportunity and the problem we have in our industry is that like you can't really do lead gen in the space industry. We've like come up with tricks, but like, it's mostly B2G. It's not even B2B, right?
What does that mean?
They're selling to the government, right? Like you'll literally have, I mean, if you look at a lot of the customer base, it's like billions of dollars of revenue are coming from like the US government, and there are some companies that like 80-90% of their revenue is like one contract, right? I mean, you're just talking like billions of dollars, like in something called geospatial, there's like this one contract that's awarded every 10 years. And that's like worth billions of dollars to like all the companies, right? Like there's no attribution there. It's helping them understand that. What I think the thing that we've done is, because there's so many engineers in our industry, we've learned how to like try to figure out ways to generate ROI. So like we'll do webinars with folks and we'll provide them with a list, but we're trying to force them to bundle it now. So like if they buy a webinar, they have to buy brand advertising with it and stuff.
Yeah.
And that allows us to go to them and be like, hey, you generated this ROI, something for them to show their boss. and we got more money out of it as well. I think that's the biggest thing, is also understanding what the C-suite thinks of advertising. We're in an industry where it's all engineers, they don't believe in marketing. But I think that's beginning to change in our industry. And it's important to just see, like, why are they advertising? Is this something that, like, is coming from the top? Is this something that they're trying to approach on a more of a bottoms up basis? So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
And then to speak to kind of what you were talking about, like designing products around their actual needs, and you mentioned webinars, and you're seeing a lot of B2B publishers do this, where a lot of like B2B companies, because their sales cycle is so long, they just need leads, and their salespeople will pick up from there. So that's why you see a lot of these webinars where they have to turn over their email address and contact information as part of the gate to getting into the webinar, and then the publisher then turns over all those email address and contact information to the advertiser. And that's why they're able to charge like $40,000 for just one webinar that only 30 people showed up to, is because if just one or two of those people convert into an actual client, then that completely pays off. And the whole thing, when you're talking about pairing it with brand advertising, that's good because when the salesperson reaches out, hopefully there's some name recognition from the person that, like, oh, I saw that company was the one that sponsored that webinar, so I know I sort of know what this company is, and so I'm more willing to take that phone call or something, right?
Yeah, and someone also asked a question about ROI. So a few points here. Firstly, I think it's very dangerous to be in the performance marketing business, especially in B2B. I mean, obviously, like, right, there are companies that their bread and butter in performance marketing, and like, if you're good at it, great, like, that's awesome. Like, if you're in an industry like space, performance marketing is just like not a realistic thing, and we're trying to educate companies about that, because the leads are so small, right? There are only so many companies that want to buy a satellite. And I think some of the frustrations that I have is that sales attribution isn't done properly. You got to understand, in order to really track marketing, you need to have sophistication across the board, right? So like, you'll talk to a company, and I ask, like, sometimes I'll get in the nitty gritty with them, because like they're saying stuff to me, and I just have to like lower expectations about, like, they're like, hey, we want to get a sale from this. I'm like, okay, how do you track attribution? Are you asking every single client what touch points they hit across the way? Like, a lot of sales teams, they're doing last I forgot what it's called, but essentially, like, the attribution point is where they first met the client, and that's 100% attribution. And that's a huge problem if you're then being tracked on attribution. So like, say I met Simon at a conference, and they put into their CRM, we met at whatever CES, but then Simon sees the ad in payload 30 times, and actually that's what causes him to buy whatever we're selling, even though it's never that simple. But let's pretend for this example, their sales teams are very rarely then doing a post-sale survey and going, hey, why did you buy this? Did you see our ads running this? Did you see us do this? And I think this is what makes the job so challenging, is that, and I don't know about in other industries, but in our industry, these companies aren't sophisticated enough, even publicly traded companies, where they're doing this type of stuff. And then you get into a dangerous game of, if you're being tracked on ROI, you can be having a lot of success that's just so hard to really create attribution to you, right? So, when I ask about ROI, I think it's also kind of a rhetorical question to help the client understand, oh, like, why are we doing this, right? Like, in our industry, they just love events, but I've actually started asking more and more, like, hey, when you go to this event, like, what is your hope? Why do you do it? And the most common answer is, oh, if we're not there, our competitor's there, right? Like, people. So I think, like, the best business to be in is be in a business where you can create so much FOMO that if you can get their competitors to advertise, they're forced to advertise with you. And it's almost like this, like, recurring cycle. And I think that's what, like, the Axios's of Axioses of the world and Politicos of the world have done, where they like have crushed it on advocacy advertising. And like, you can't really measure the National Corn Association or whatever putting an ad in Politico, but they just know it has influence because that is read by politicians, right? There are some tricks you can do. You can get testimonials from clients. You can try to get case studies, but like, again, if you have a company like in the geospatial industry, in our industry, you're talking about a sales cycle of 10 years. I mean, that is just like ridiculous. Like there is no case study there. There is no like attribution or ROI there.
Yeah. Nick Meacham, was your hard stop 15 minutes or 30 minutes after the hour?
I can go for another 10.
Oh, another 10 minutes. Okay, so I do have questions for Matt Brown and Nicholas Carlson. We had a newsletter question, but I want to use Nick Meacham before he has to leave. So I want to talk a little bit about events, since that's really, a big part of your expertise. I know a lot of B2B publishers, they say they want to get into events, but it's very intimidating to them. Obviously, there's some huge costs associated with it. Plus you got to actually get people to show up at a physical location, which is harder to get than getting them to show up to a website. If you were advising like a B2B publisher on launching an event in terms of how big of a splash they should do, should they test their toes in the water to throw something small? What are some of the things you would advise, like a checklist for launching an event series within the B2B space?
Sure. I mean, the main thing, the few steps that we took were, we were really spending a lot of time looking at what our audience was consuming and seeing what was interesting. So for example, one of the events that we launched in the last few years was an event around streaming, sports streaming, OTT, but we launched that prior to when it becoming a big thing. And just because we looked at the data of what stories were being consumed on our website, that they were consistently the top ranking stories on our site. So that was the first touch point. Then we looked at the data and saw, okay, how many people in those organizations, the traditional companies, that we can see through our newsletter data and our website data that are relevant to that same space. And we could see there was a good chunk of people there. And then we did a bit of qualitative conversations with some of those people to say, hey, if we did this, what do you think? People that we would either want to be in the room or speak. And they were all showing a lot of interest in it. And those were sort of the first key steps. Then we had to make a decision on whether we wanted to do, to your point about a local, I would call it like a city-based event or a destination event. So do we want to take people somewhere and make it a destination where people have to come to, or do we need to take it to where they are? So the example would be, do you bring it to New York or do you put it in Vegas? That sort of dynamic. For us, it was, do you do it in London or do you do it in Madrid or another city, which is what we did in Europe. And they were the key steps, but we were very pragmatic in our approach. We weren't going, oh, we want this to be a multi-million-pound event from day one. We want thousands of people. Our goal is in 3 years is to be thousands of people. We just went, okay, be conservative, start from the bottom up. So be very, we want a really good base of a couple of hundred people. And if you start there, the vibe will be good. You're not overstretching yourself, so you're not putting yourself at a great risk. Even if you go at that sort of level, you only need a couple of partners on board to at least cover your costs. And we were pretty good at doing those sorts of deals. So that felt pretty comfortable for us to get to. But if we went into the market and say, hey, we're going to launch an event for 1,000 people, the risk then jumps through the roof for you. So you have to be a little bit pragmatic is the way I describe it, or at least careful on, you don't need to go to the big home run swing if your event's got the right dynamic in the room. And we don't have any event over 1,000 people, and we're quite happy with that dynamic because we're able to charge, well over $1,000 a ticket for our events. And sponsors are paying tens of thousands to be involved. And rather than trying to be a trade show where the risks are huge, if, I don't know, a pandemic pops up or other measures might pop up that might impact or put your event at risk, that sort of size, you don't have those sorts of issues really at play.
Yeah, so you would maybe say run a survey in your newsletter or something like that. That is which of these cities would you be willing to travel to for an event and see, and maybe gauge something like that? Or like what of these like sub niches of having an event about like which of these would you be most likely to go to an event, and kind of collect data that way, but also just keep it small, like maybe start with like a small thing for maybe only 100 people to see if you can get 100 people to show up, and then build your way up from there.
Yeah, definitely start from the bottom. I mean, my view, I'm not that I'm risk averse, but I think in this day and age, you can try and go for the home run, and you can swing and miss hard, and then you put your whole business at risk if you're a small to medium business. And that's not, I wasn't prepared to do that, put our business at risk. So taking a bottom up approach definitely was what I felt logical. And the destination concept, you know, one of the things we did look at when we looked at that is the propensity to travel. So we did it for the broadcast sector, which is high travelers. So for them to go to different places wasn't that big a deal for them. Other industries, it might be a bigger deal. So you have to be considerate on how willing they would be to travel. How used are they to traveling to other events, and whether your event can fit into that calendar.
Yeah. And, you know, we only have Nick for a few more minutes, so feel free to ask questions in his few remaining minutes. But in terms of like, you know, ticket prices versus sponsors, what have you found in terms of like, you know, the balance between the two? Because obviously you want as many people there as possible, so the sponsors will pay a lot of money, but then you also want to generate good money from the tickets. Like, should the ticket sales be like covering all the overhead and the sponsors are the profit? Or like, how do you think about those two dynamics with each other in terms of attendance and profit and revenue and things like that?
Yeah, we've targeted areas or industries where we know the buy side has an interest in that event to the point they're willing to pay. Whereas in some industries, normally they'll be heavily comped, you know, complimentary passes, or you'll have to guess them, or whatever it might be. There'll be a whole like strategy on just to get the buy side in the room. Ours is, we think we can create an event which they will value. So, you know, it's an area that they're trying to learn more about. So, for example, the OTT streaming space in sports is one of the areas that we had best success at, because everyone's going, we don't know what to do here. Everyone's doing lots. It's moving really fast. What do we do? And because of that, it was quite easy for us to sell to the buy side as a result. So that has been an important part. Is what we were surprised when we would survey our audiences is, and this might sound a bit obvious, but how many people were actually interested in coming to an event to learn and to come to digest content and to hear from people in the industry. Most people, when I would talk to them, think everyone just goes to events to network, but actually, you know, they do want to learn from people off stage, but actually people are just coming to learn, particularly in this fast-paced world we live in these days around technology and so forth. So we were targeting areas really that did appeal to the masses, and not just, you know, for example, in sports, sponsorship is a huge area, but the buy side of that industry has very little interest being in the room with getting pitched at. So brands don't want to be in a room where they're just going to be inundated with people pitching them. Yeah. So that's not an area where we could focus on, even though it's a core business driver of the industry.
So this is another thing I'm wondering about is like, what do you offer advertisers beyond just like their logo on the program and maybe a booth? Like what do they really care? Like sponsors for an event? Yeah. Like what are the things that like they really care about?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is they definitely want involvement in the content. So what we do is have different layers of that. So one could be they just sponsor a session. One could be that they have a case study. So we will work with them very heavily. So we have a curate content team, which will work with them on either bringing in their client into that, so they can, you know, raise the credibility bar. So an example might be a tech company providing services to the NBA will bring the NBA into that session so they can talk about what they're doing for the NBA. Or we actually have a series of smaller sessions which are like tech demos to showcase what they actually do. So it's very much on stage stuff. We do have exhibition and all those other things, but on stage is where most of those opportunities come. We just have to build our agendas in a way that makes sure that we're pragmatic on who's going to be in the room. We're not over offering. You know, if we try and build the agenda so they might only be looking for 50 people in the room, and that's all they need for it to be a successful session if the right type of people are at the event. So that's really it. It's a lot of it is on stage stuff, but it's not trying to, I don't know, wrap something in something it's not. It's very much, it is what
Yeah.
it is on the tin. It is a session which is going to be presenting technology or a case study, and we will work with them to tell them, make sure they're not just up on stage selling. So the content
Yeah.
is valuable to the people that are paying to be in the room.
I've seen some publishers who feel icky about putting sponsors in the content, allowing them to do the introductions for the speakers or the panels or something like that. So they're sort of part of the content and they get to introduce who they are and stuff like that, but like they're not actually on the panel or the speaker themselves. Have you tried any of that? Do they value? Do you think sponsors value that?
Yeah, we just find the sponsors value it, the audience doesn't. And so what we try and do is make sure that we do stuff that the audience will value. So I call it the triple win. So it's the win for us because it's a commercial deal. It's a win for the audience because they're getting good content, and it's a win for the client because they get the platform they're after. But if I don't think the audience is going to get value from hearing from the sponsor, we won't do it. We will tell them we want to do it another way to get them involved. And most of them absolutely buy that because they rather that everyone gets value from it than do something that's forced. And not forced and a bit awkward, and so it typically works that way. As long as we're very open with it, we'll tell you what not to do, so it doesn't flop, and you get more value out of it. Most of them are pretty up for it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I know you only have 3 remaining minutes. Does anybody have any questions for Nick before he has to head out to for another engagement?
That was super helpful, Nick. Thank you so much for that. I did have a question on as far as how many people proportionally do you feel like are the main driver is coming in to learn new things versus being there for the reason of FOMO? Because I find that this sort of is different in different industries.
So can you repeat that, or just what exactly is
the main driver? Because I know you said this is an event, your portfolio, it's a portfolio of events. The main driver for attending, would you say, is primarily to come in and learn, or primarily because the space are there? And I know it's definitely both, but I'm just curious to hear.
Yeah, we find that when the data comes in, it's about 50-50 that are there for that put their primary reason to be networking versus learning. A lot of people will put both as they're like, if they can, they put their both of the reason, but we find it's 30, 40, 45% it's nearly 50-50. It's not quite 50-50. That is there to learn. Buy side almost always there to learn. And so you have to make sure you're facilitating that.
Yeah.
But
anytime
the network.
So I was gonna say, anytime we see survey results, I find that anytime somebody is attending for networking and they have this sort of underlying, of learning something that they didn't expect, that the return next year is typically much better.
Yeah, well, I would always find that if someone's saying they're there for networking, what they're there to sell. And it's a slight difference. People will say it's networking, but it's really they're there to sell. And do they meet people they can sell to? That's what they're after. Whereas if you look at from, say, someone like, let's say the NBA is an example I use, they come to our events because they want to learn. They do want to also meet their peers. They want to meet the NFL and other properties. And they do want to meet service providers who are solving problems that they have. So they come for that more complete approach. But yeah, networking typically for sort of B2B events is really just I want people that I can sell to and be inundated. When I go up and talk to a random person, there's someone I can sell my product to.
Mm-hmm. That's a great distinction. Thank you so much, Nick. So helpful today.
Yeah. And Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
So I want to turn to Wayne now. I know I've been making him wait patiently. He had a question about newsletters, and I want to throw it to Matt first, and then Nicholas Carlson second.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for putting this together, Simon. I said it, I think, pretty well in the chat. I am curious how a minimally viable curated newsletter comes across to your audience. If you are creating or you're curating content that is of interest to them, will they bear with you as you figure out the layout, figure out your voice, your tone, and get something from an early stage to something that is perhaps closer to what you would be proud of, in a few months down the road?
Yeah, and Wayne, just give us a 1-sentence bio of who you are.
Yeah, sure. I'm an attorney. I have my own business. I ghostwrite for attorneys at large international law firms, and I am interested in starting a newsletter focused on an area of the law and the legal industry that I think is criminally underserved by the established legal media outlets.
Yeah. So Matt, you kind of created like a minimal viable product because you were at Vox Media, you had a full-time job, and you kind of had to like test the waters. You want to tackle this question first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my name is Matt Brown. I run Extra Points. It is a newsletter that covers business and policy and off the field issues in the college athletics industry. And it started off, I think pretty similar to how Wayne's describing. The initial version of that product was curated. It was completely free. It came out 2 or 3 times a week. And my experience, and it's always going to be different from industry to industry, depending on what your competition is. But because the barrier to entry to starting a curated newsletter is relatively low, there's a lot of them. And I think there's especially a lot of them for general business, tech, startups, marketing. There's a ton of these things. And people generally aren't going to read 4 or 5 of them. They're probably only going to read 1 or 2, and maybe not even every day. So in order for me, I think any kind of curated newsletter experience to be viable, it has to, at the very beginning, still add some kind of value by giving that reader something that they're not going to be able to find anywhere else without spending an enormous amount of time. So if you are doing a curated newsletter in the legal space, I think my advice would probably be, it's going to have to start somewhere pretty niche, and leverage your own experience at being able to find stories and then, add value, whether that's commentary or being really good at digging up and finding that news that they're not going to find in the 3 to 4 other general legal digests or policy digests that they might be able to find. So like in my world, there's a handful of newsletters that at least in some level cover college athletics. There's Front Office Sports, there's Sportico, there's Sports Business Journal, ESPN, The Athletic might offer things. Many of those are going to be focused on on-field results. I care about who wins the college football national title on Monday. I've been writing about this for 12 years, but God knows there's a gajillion people that know the X's and O's or have covered TCU or covered Georgia. And it would be very difficult for me to offer something that's unique in that space, especially because I live in Chicago. I'm not in Athens. I'm not in Atlanta. I'm not in Fort Worth. But I can talk about their financial disclosures. I could talk about their budgets. I could talk about how population demographic shifts have impacted how those programs might be able to recruit. And unlike a lot of other football reporters, I read the Chronicle of Higher Education, or I read Inside Higher Ed, or I read some of these other similar publications. So I might find something that maybe somebody might miss on Twitter. And that would be the advice that I have to give here. If you're just trying to ape Morning Brew, but like Morning Brew for X, I think you will probably fail because you don't have that scale. And I would, for me, and this isn't a diss on Morning Brew, like I think their great innovation was in audience acquisition rather than content. The content's fine, but like they didn't get as big as they did because they were really good just at translating MSNBC to millennials. They did it because they were really good at building a flywheel, and that's kind of what you have to do in that space, I think.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Nicholas, but also Joachim, I know you've been waiting patiently. I have a question coming up for you. So, Nick, you work with traditional publishers, B2B publishers, right? And my guess is when you start working for them, they have a pretty bare bones newsletter product. It probably is just like a daily or weekly roundup of links to articles that could be found on the website. Kind of speaking to Wayne's point about voice and trying to create some kind of differentiated product that can drive signups in and of itself. What are some of the things that you kind of advise your clients to do?
And
just
off,
give us
my
a
name is...
very, very quick overview.
So we can talk very quick about it. So primarily I work with the B2B publishers. They already have a newsletter and they're looking for the best way to generate revenue from them. Whether that is, promoting white papers or ads, native ads, the events, drive subscribers, all of that. When it comes to the quality of the newsletter, it seems like as long as you, as Matt alluded to, like you find a niche and you provide a lot of value to that audience, the audience and the advertisers seem to not care a lot about the formatting and the looks and feel of the newsletter. It's more about, can you offer the advertisers and obviously the readers value in the email that they're receiving from you. So I have examples of clients who are medical publications, for example, and they might have hundreds of different newsletters that will target very specific things, like specific diseases, for example. And if you're someone who then for example is a hospital looking for a specialist in that particular disease, you go to that publisher and you say, I'm looking for someone who knows a lot about this and care enough that they subscribe to a newsletter to learn more about it. Then you put a job ad in there. You can charge a lot for that. But I mean, in terms of the minimal viable product and of what people seem to be willing to subscribe to, I wouldn't say, well, thankfully in the business space, it seems like you can get away with a lot. Something that's a lot rougher around the edges, and people are still going to subscribe to it and find it, assuming that it provides value to them. That's my real quick take on that.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to talk about is like niche, and obviously with B2B, you can niche down really far. You can launch individual niche products within your B2B publication. Joachim, you launched several years ago a publication towards the biotech industry, correct? And I think it started out as a French language blog, but then you realized that the market was too small for that. You switched over to English language. Obviously, biotech is like part of something that's like, something within a much broader healthcare industry and stuff like that. How do you think about, niche content and how to make that balance between creating something that's truly differentiated versus trying to go as broad as possible? Like, what do advertisers or readers kind of value more?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So just to present myself, I'm Joachim Écoute. I'm the founder of labiotech.eu. We started in 2014. And today we have around 100,000 monthly visitors, so mostly coming from the biotech, biopharma industry. And most of our revenues are from advertising, and like a lot of you from native advertising mostly. So yeah, the story is interesting. So we started in France as a student blog. So we were studying with my partner biotech in university and launching kind of a curation website at the time. Was not yet the big newsletter revolution. So we had a website with curated article on it, and we did it for 2 years. And when we graduated, we decided to to leave the startup life kind of. So we decided to go bigger. We went to launch labiotech.eu, so the European version with English language. And here our goal was really to scale the traffic rapidly. In terms of choosing the niche, I think both works, because I know well this biotech media industry, and there are still a few media existing just in France for biotech. They can sustain a small team of 2-3 people, so it works. There is still something to do there. But if you want to scale to a bigger business, and here we're rethinking just about having a bigger company, we needed to basically go to a larger audience. And in Europe, we also identified a need. There was really something missing. I can really relate to what you said at the beginning, Simon, with old paper magazines. In the industry, it was still the case for biotech. We were seeing really old print magazines and no digital equivalent on the European market. So we just decided to do it, and it worked quite well at the beginning. Like we scaled up the traffic rapidly. Now I would say we face a bit the challenging side of having a bigger audience, because we compete with mostly US websites that are established since maybe 15-20 years, and they already captured a lot of the attention, and they have maybe 3-4 times our traffic. So it's not easy to be in this industry because it's a niche, but it's not too small. When you look really at the pharma industry, actually it's quite a lot of people worldwide. And I think the secret here with this kind of mid-size niche is to really be different in the content you make. I know that the content we make is really unique. We have more like a storytelling tone. We make a bit more engaging content, you know, like list cycles with top companies to know these kind of things. And the competition is more, I would say, conservative on the content they produce. So it's really like short news reporting. So I think that's also a question of how you make your content really stand out from the competition.
But I think you did really succeed in terms of your niche strategy, because you started out as French language only. And my guess is that the competition at the French language only biotech coverage was probably almost non-existent when you started. So you had that early advantage there. Then you expanded, but you didn't go to covering all of biotech. You specifically covered biotech in Europe because you recognized there were already several publications in the US that had a huge head start. And so, but there was nobody in the European space that was covering just biotech European companies. And so you then expanded that, you got really good at that and built a really good audience around that. And then recently you did launch a US version or a more worldwide version.
Yep.
But because you had built out that credibility in France and then Europe, now, even though there are entrenched players in the US, it's not like you're starting from scratch. You already have that credibility that you've been building up in Europe, so then it'll make it easier for you to focus in on the US as well. So I feel like if I were coming away from this and I were like a new publisher that was thinking to get into B2B, I would start very niche on a very subset of something, and then as I'm as I'm growing and expanding and adding new journalists, then I can kind of expand within that niche. Would you kind of agree with that kind of that kind of strategy for someone who's just starting out?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I had a discussion just this week with someone in France trying to launch a niche newsletter in a specific area of biotech. So even going, deeper into the niche. And I think that's smart actually, because you can really go small in a very tiny portion of the audience to capture the attention. And then from there you build up your way to maybe something else, or even having some verticals, like launching, different newsletters or things like this. Can work really well. And I think for us, it benefited to start small in France, then go to Europe. And now that we have more resources playing on the bigger field. So yeah, I think that's a good strategy.
I have a quick question, Simon, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Structurally, Joachim, are these expansions, are they subsets? Are they different spin-offs, or are they the content that's adapted in multiple languages?
No, so from the French website to the European website, it was really a wipeout. So we killed the French website and we launched a new version on a new domain. So it was from labiotech.fr to .eu, exactly.
Yeah.
For the global expansion we had recently, and by the way, this was following the acquisition of our company by a software company. So there is also a strategic reason behind it. This scale up has been done without any changes to the website. We are just adding content to the same website. We just communicated about the changes with our readers, and that's it. We are even keeping the same domain name, so we still have .eu, but I don't think it's a big issue actually. We are thinking about some small rebranding to make it a bit less anchored in Europe and make it maybe a bit more international in terms of brand awareness. But that's it. And we're keeping the same website because it works. It's still English. We never tried to translate because we are lucky to be in an industry that is English everywhere. Like really, like if you're working in Spain, Germany, whatever, you have to speak English to work in biotech. So our audience speak English, and we don't need to translate. And translating will force us, I think, to go back to smaller niches. Yeah, so it could be a business idea, going in different verticals, like having biotech France, biotech UK, whatever. But I think for us, the idea was more to go from a small location and expand step by step.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you, Joachim. I want to spend the last amount of time just talking about like paid subscriptions. In the B2C space, the way to do paid subscriptions usually is like through some kind of metered paywall at the New York Times, Wall Street, or Washington Post, LA Times. You get to consume a few number of free stories, and then you hit a paywall. What I'm noticing in the B2B space is like them a lot of times actually trying to create differentiated content for the paid versus the free. Okay, all right. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate your input. The paid versus the free. This is what we're doing right now is a good example of that. Whereas for the paid subscribers, I'm not just sending you an extra version of my paid newsletter. I'm doing these office hours because I want to provide some extra value that you don't get if you're on the free list. And so, Matt, you have a paid newsletter. In terms of like thinking about B2B and like what businesses, what your readers, your hardcore readers that would actually pay, how do you think about like differentiating paid content versus free content? Because I don't think many B2B publishers use metered paywalls or anything like that.
I don't think they do either. We looked at it. I took a couple of calls with tech companies that offered that. We ran the numbers. We couldn't find a way that it would make financial sense for us. So our company is probably maybe a little bit different from how some of yours might be set up. Like one we're pretty small. The whole enterprise has about 10 full-time employees, so we don't really have the depth to go long on the event space or other places. We make for Extra Points, about 85% of our revenue comes from subscriptions. The rest come from advertising and sponsorships, and we're trying to grow that a little bit more. And our paid subscriptions, you just half the content is behind a paywall, and you either pay monthly or pay annually. There's two groups of people that buy it for us, which kind of informs what we decide to paywall and what we decide to make free. We have an increasingly large number of our readers are college students who use this as a textbook supplement. And this is a place where I think, honestly, B2B publications in a lot of industries could do more to sell into, because paperback textbooks are extremely expensive. Many of them, for a variety of subjects, are inaccessible to undergrads. Like in our world, Sports Business Journal is commonly used for people that are studying sports management. But SBJ, and I say this with love, is written for 50 and 60-year-olds. It's written for senior executives. It's not written for a 20-year-old who got a 25 on his ACT and doesn't really care about what this multimedia rights holder is doing with the NHL. So we're able to fill that niche. We sell then to professors. We sell to deans. And we package that with other curriculum supplements. The other big chunk would then be industry practitioners, people who are athletic directors, people who are conference commissioners, people who work at an ESPN, an Adidas, a Nike, or some kind of industry that serves college athletics. So then, as we're thinking about what we want to write about, what are those individuals more interested in that they're not going to find somewhere else? Our free content, it tends to skew a little bit more on the B2C side. Like we still have a fair number of people who read our newsletter who don't work in the industry, who are just degenerate sports fans. So if I'm going to write about something that might go viral or has a very wide audience, say coverage of licensed video game products within college athletics, that's going to hit Reddit. And a lot of those people might not necessarily pay for what I'm doing because they don't care about remodeling a basketball court in Little Rock. But I can, it's still valuable for me to have them on the list, or that might be a free story. You know, as next week, I'm traveling to the NCAA convention. I'm talking to a bunch of people that work in the industry. We're going to talk about bylaws. We're going to talk about revenue generation. We're going to talk about televising the women's basketball tournament, which is really useful to people that have .edu in their email addresses, maybe less interesting to the person on the college football subreddit. So that's an easier thing for me to figure out what to charge for and what not to. Like my general operating thesis is the broader the audience, the more likely I am to make it free. And the more specific to people that need to know this for their jobs and can expense my newsletter on their continuing education account, the more likely I am to charge for it.
So like, yeah, to translate, like the more you think like publishing maybe like a hot take or something, the kind of thing you could see someone, you know, sharing to Twitter or Facebook or whatever their, you know, whatever platform they like to populate. If you could see a lot of people going into and wanting to share that, that's something that you might want to put for free versus the paid stuff is the more kind of in the weeds, super nitty gritty stuff that they won't want to actually share, but is actually hugely valuable for the people who are really hardcore in the industry. Nick, what in terms of like when you're advising your B2B publishing clients on how to erect paywalls and what to think about, how to create products that people would actually want to pay for, what are some of the things that you advise them on?
So can't speak a whole lot on that topic. So I'm primarily on the newsletter monetization piece and really driving, you know, revenue from those people who are signing up to that free newsletter. But there's definitely, I can definitely see that, you know, B2B publishers who are charging for it are looking for that differentiation. So sometimes they might have paid newsletters as well. Then obviously it is more about, you know, the same conversation as you would have, like, what are you putting behind a paywall and what is it that you want to have available for the wider audience, kind of like as Matt talked about here as well. But I'm gonna leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Well, no worries there. Okay, we're kind of coming up on the hour. I'm never kind of a rush to get off of here. I always recognize though that sometimes people only budget in an hour. I always kind of like to open up the end of these. Well, first I want to just thank all, you know, our guests, Joachim, Matt, both Nix and Ari for coming on. Thank you so much. I always appreciate when guests come on. You're welcome to stay for a few more minutes, but feel free to leave if you have any other kind of pressing engagements or anything like that. But yeah, just love to just kind of open it up. We don't necessarily have to spend these. And if anybody wants to put their, not just the guests, but anybody here wants to put their name and email address into the chats in case people want to contact each other afterwards, definitely feel free to do that. So yeah, just love to just kind of open it up and just hear what people, you know, we're heading into 2023. It's January. We're heading into a possible recession. I'd love to just kind of open it up and hear what people were thinking about in the media space, things I should be covering in the newsletter, things I've recently covered that you want to talk about. I don't know. What do you guys want to chat about? You have me here. I'm happy to stick around. Anybody?
I mean, I don't mind sharing this. And Simon, I think we've talked about it before, and it's
Sure.
something that is maybe other operators have some insight on. One of the two things I am most concerned about, I guess, for our business as we head into 2023. One is the stability of audience acquisition engines. So this may be different for other B2B or mostly B2B entities, but we still get a lot of our readership through Twitter. Our metrics indicate that about 30% of our free subscribers over a 30-day period generally get on our listserv through something that was shared on Twitter, either through me, where I have a decently audience, or through other reporters, because Twitter, for all of its faults, is still the social network of record for sports, for live events and a lot of sports analysis. So if that platform becomes less stable, we've already canceled all of our Twitter ad buys for 2023. Finding other places to regularly find that audience is a challenge. And I know like the kind of conventional wisdom is, well, if you start a newsletter, you own your audience, right? You don't have to worry about platforms. Like that's cool, man.
Yeah.
But I still have to rely on that stuff to find the people, whether it's Twitter or Google or Facebook or some other entity. And that there's some struggles there. The other thing, and I don't know if anyone else has used these, is on the ad front, we can sell customized ads to MBA programs who are looking to recruit undergraduates. We have a lot of those, or somebody that's trying to reach an athletic director. But that's a long sales cycle. It takes a long time. And so we use house ads through a lot of newsletter services like Post Apex or SwapStack, Paved. We have accounts in all of those. And my experience has been pretty lousy for these, right? And I might make $30 a newsletter of some of these ads. The conversion rates are pretty low, and heading into a recession, and with so many of these marketplaces over-indexed for like one industry, I have concerns. Like I would love to know if anybody else has found other ways to not automate, but make that a little bit more efficient, because hoping to get 75 cents cost per click off something that I might not even be able to track off of a Babbel ad isn't really a great experience for anybody.
Yeah, Charles, feel free to unmute yourself and talk. But to answer your question about acquisition, I'm finding like every now and then some big newsletter links to my newsletter, and that's where I see the most conversion. So networking, I mean, obviously the old school tricks of doing the newsletter swaps and the recommendation swaps and stuff like that, I've never been a big fan of that. I don't want to recommend someone unless I really am into their newsletter. But networking with other newsletter writers, making sure you're shooting them an email whenever you think there's something relevant to them. That's where I'm seeing a lot of the growth, is whenever a really big newsletter links to mine, in terms of seeing a ton of signups. Way more that I see the most signups, well, one, through the Substack recommendations tool, but then two, through just coming in through direct traffic, which is a lot of people just sharing my stuff on email or newsletters or in their Slack channel and stuff like that. Charles, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a question for Matt. You said that you that you used to spend money with Twitter to buy ads, and then you stopped it. I was curious why you stopped buying it. Was it just a performance tracking kind of a thing, or more the uncertainty or the chaos around Twitter?
It's more of the latter informing the former. The experience itself for buying ads has become more complicated in my experience, because they laid off most of the people that worked on those campaigns. The other big concern is when we talk about chaos around Twitter, for me, is brand safety. So if I look at my phone and I look at the kind of companies that are now buying ads on Twitter that appear in not much as my feed, but those are my colleagues relative to what they were 6 months ago, or realizing that I don't want one of my promoted tweets to then appear next to something that would be considered highly brand unsafe, which is what the concern that AAA brands are having. It's not really worth it, especially because I'm not looking at spending $15,000 on a campaign here. Is it worth me spending $1,000 on a promoted tweet if there's a risk that, not just being next to a white supremacist or something, but for us, a lot of it is we don't want to be near gambling, which is an overwhelming, massive growth area within sports, because that undermines a lot of our editorial messages. And if we can't verify that we're not going to be 3 inches away from a casino, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to us.
Yeah. To speak to your other question, I've signed up for the SwapStack, the Paved, these supposed marketplaces that are going to connect you to advertisers. And the only thing they really offer are these, as you alluded to, these like affiliate links and stuff like that, where you can, if you drive X number of subscribers to another newsletter, you get $3 per conversion and stuff like that. And I just haven't really found that to be worth my time, because I just can't calculate how many subscriptions I'm going to drive. Like I'd rather just, sell a set rate. One thing that I've found is really successful is just having a super transparent media page, landing page that I'm constantly pushing my readers towards, that really kind of lays out who my audience is, what my pricing is and stuff like that. Like 100% of my advertisers have come in through that. And then also just like, that's where I think it's really good to have paid subscriptions, is because anytime you have unfilled ad inventory, like I did this week, one of my sponsors just completely ghosted me, didn't pay his invoice, and then didn't send me his ad copy or anything like that. So I just plugged this office hours here. And it drove a few paid, like several paid subscriptions. So almost made me almost as much money as running an ad would have. So, making really good use of that unsold inventory to promote other products, I think is always like a good use of that. Or sometimes I use that unused inventory to promote my advertising page. So with the hope that it'll drive, more sponsors down the line. But I think like that's one of the underutilized things with a lot of media companies is not realizing that their advertisers are also part of their audience and trying to convert them that way versus like cold pitching and stuff like that.
Question for you, Simon.
What's that?
Question for you.
Sure.
When I think of paid products, so I have a fairly small newsletter, but it's highly targeted. It's less than 1,000 people. It's called Daily Inspire, made up of mostly clients. So I think there's like 740 on there, but highly targeted. 93% are either C-suite or founders. And because I serve a couple of different verticals, I'm thinking a lot about paid products for, for the specific niches. Have you always done just like a paid subscription? Is that your main thing, or have you done separate, like either white papers or specific products that are not, client services for these particular people?
In terms of like the different ways I monetize my newsletter.
Yep.
So the first like 6 or 7 years after launching my newsletter, I did it all through, I monetized 100% through client services. And so basically the newsletter was just a lead generation tool to generate clients for me. But the problem with that obviously is it doesn't scale very much. You kind of run out of capacity. And if you're not really willing to hire up, which I didn't want to be someone's boss, I didn't want to be doing that. I didn't do it. So then in 2020, I launched paid subscriptions. And it just really kind of floundered for like 2 years trying to figure out, what to actually offer. It took me a while to land on these office hours as like a truly kind of differentiated content that I can offer. And then launching sponsorships. And now that I've, I don't know if I'm answering your question here, but like if I were to go back in time, I would have kept it free longer and launched advertising first and paid subscriptions much longer. And I don't know if you read Brian Morrissey's newsletter, The Rebooting, that's the way that he's going. And I think he's much more, he's much smarter about it than I was, is because you really, like, you're just one person. And it sounds like you also have other duties besides running your newsletter. You don't want to tie your hand behind your back. You don't, because the second you offer a paid subscription, then you start putting out a product for those paid subscribers. And a paid subscription, it's not helping you grow your email list because it's locked behind a paywall. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't get shared on social media, all that kind of stuff. So don't tie your hands behind your back. I would try to figure out what are some other products you could launch where you can keep most of your content for free as long as you can, so you can build out your email list. And maybe only when you're ready to work full-time on your newsletter, then maybe think about launching paid subscriptions in addition to however else you monetize it. One thing I have launched recently is I've been testing out a beta tool from Substack. It's not available to everybody yet, but it's like a consulting tool where you can go into my Calendly and book a call for me for like 1 hour, and it charges you, like I'm charging like $250 for a consulting phone call. And what I like about that is it doesn't bog me down with 30 hours of work per week, but it can allow people to at least get some high level consulting time with me. So it's like a way to kind of balance offering at least some client services, but not let it consume your entire 40-hour work week or something like that. I was rambling a lot.
The consulting is driving, the consulting is basically the runway for the creator business. So I appreciate that insight. That's helpful.
Yeah. What else? What, Margie? I don't think have we met?
Sorry, and I was about to hop off. No, I was going to say hi. So Simon, I spent the holiday break catching up on Brian Morrissey's newsletter. And so from October, there was a link to your work. And then as soon as I saw your work, I knew it was a good fit. So I've really been reflecting on that, about how for considering paying for a paid subscription, you sort of know it right away if the content's going to be a good fit. So I appreciate that. And then you had the office hours within like 2 or 3 days of my paying.
Yeah.
So I work for Jeff Salingo, who's an author and journalist who writes about higher education for both a B2C and a B2B business. And I serve as chief of staff, which is pretty much project management since we're such a tiny staff.
Wow. So he's like he's like a celebrity writer, and you're like his like behind the scenes guru who makes the train run on time.
Yes. So there's a podcast he co-hosts, and Matt Brown has been on the podcast twice in the fall since there's been so much going on in college sports. And we do, I guess, mostly what you would call client services, webinars, white papers, and he has an email newsletter that comes out twice a week.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, it was great to meet you, and I hope to see you on a lot of other office hours to come.
Thank you. I'll be here.
Yeah.
And I better scoot. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Thanks. We got Tony on the phone. Tony on the line. We haven't seen him in a while. How you doing?
Good, Simon. Thanks for doing this. Another really good one.
Yeah. So you kind of straddle the line between B2B and B2C. So you have a Charlotte-based newsletter, but it focuses on the business sector of Charlotte. Do you think of yourself as more B2B or more to B2C?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a sort of tension between, if you go really B2B, that market's a lot smaller.
Yeah,
we try to straddle that line a little bit, and what Matt was saying about how you segment the paid versus the free, that really resonated with me, because we definitely paywall the stuff that's a little more B2B, and the stuff that's B2C, like you were talking about, that could get a lot of interest and traffic. We usually don't paywall those. So yeah, we do a little bit of a little bit of both. And I mean, we kind of have to do a little B2C because the market, even though Charlotte's a pretty good sized city, 800, 900,000 people, I feel like in order to keep it growing, we have to do. I mean, we want to do things that are a little more a little more consumer friendly. Just since we're geographically located, we don't have the ability to. If you live in California, you're not really going to subscribe to the Charlotte Ledger.
Yeah, and I've noticed that more and more publishers that are either on the B2B side or the B2B side, they're trying to launch like verticals within themselves that cater to the other side. Like there's a B2B sports website that I'm drawing a blank on. I invited the guy to come on, but he was too busy. But like he launched like a more kind of B2C sports newsletter and stuff like that. And so you could see them trying to basically, going back to that theme that I was talking with Joachim of like starting super niche to differentiate yourself within the market. But then once you dominate that specific niche, then trying to responsibly, broaden your scope and stuff like that.
It's tough. I mean, it's two very different strategies. I mean, if you're B2B, you can charge $1,000 for an event. You can charge, $500 a year for a newsletter. But if you're B2C, it's like, I have people who are like, $9 a month, I don't know, too rich for my blood, that kind of thing. And it's like, it can get a little tricky. But yeah, I guess the answer maybe is just try to segment that out and have one strategy that appeals to your hardcore business people, and then another strategy that's a little more general that maybe you sell more general ads off of or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Chris, you've been quiet. What's your kind of interest in B2B?
Yeah. Hey, Simon. I have run a B2B content marketing, helping brands act like media companies business for a while now. I also have my own brand, on the personal side. So that's my interest.
Yeah. And so you call it, I'm guessing you call it like brand publishing.
What I would call what we do.
Yeah.
That would be another way to characterize it. Sure.
Yeah, and I obviously a lot of companies are really interested in that kind of thing. What I've always found is like, are they willing to, because they're used to the immediate returns of like direct response advertising. like correct me if I'm wrong, but it takes like a good solid 6 to 12 months of investment, of like real investment in terms of creating really good content before they even start to see any kind of returns on that. So that could be hard to get them to relinquish budgets on that front.
I think it depends on the brand. I think that 5 years ago, the first question was ROI, and you had an ROI discussion earlier in this conversation.
Yeah.
That's not the conversation that I'm having very often. I think that more and more businesses are recognizing that the ROI, at least the types of clients that I engage with, that the ROI is a phone call, that the ROI is how do you stay relevant with audiences that matter to you, even when you're not physically present. And so the types of companies that I'm engaging with, it's not direct response. They're not looking at, how do I, get someone, in the middle of a funnel or at the end of the funnel to hit click and, buy something. It's not that type of, it's not that type of engagement.
Yeah. Wayne, you also work with brands, but I think they're like legal companies and stuff like that. How easy is it for you to get them to kind of relinquish budget and stuff like that, to actually put real money into that kind of content? He might be just listening and not talking. Okay. All right. Well, I'll take that as my cue. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this week's Office Hours. I'm kind of like torn because like I'm always like looking at the hour coming up, and I feel like we've all like every single time we do these, we're just like we only got to like maybe half of the questions I wanted to ask. Do you guys like the format? Is there something we should be changing? Should we making them longer? I know that people's time is precious and they don't necessarily always have an hour and a half to 2 hours. Should it just be around one guest? I don't know. Like I think like my next one, actually, we're going to have like a Sean Griffey who runs Industry Dive, and he's going to be kind of like a featured guest around him, and we'll all be able to ask him questions. I don't know, what are your thoughts on the format and how we can, because I also felt like people weren't talking as much during this one, like I was asking all the questions.
I definitely think that if you have one guest at this a lot of time, it works really well. I love the panel format because I actually really appreciate getting a bunch of insight, and for that 75 minutes, I think is usually good, like an hour and a half, hour 15. But I like that because I like to cross, what people's different approaches and the different industries. But I think if it is someone, I've seen like 30 minutes to an hour work really well for a single guest.
Yeah.
But these are super valuable. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering how I get more people. Like Chris, you were going to say something?
I'm with Tanya. I think the format is great the way it is. I like the kind of the modified, you have 2 or 3 speakers, but if you did one, I think 30 minutes is great for that. And I agree with her on hour 15. I think this is perfect.
Yeah. How do you think I could get people talking more? Like, should I just start calling on people and telling them to ask a question, or what's your interest in this space? Or I don't know, like, how do I get people to ask more questions?
Yeah, so sorry, my light's terrible here. I'm sitting in the car. We do a similar thing. We do a monthly online chat, and we have about 100 people on it. And what we do, we get people to fire questions into the chat, because a lot of people don't want to come off mic, but they'll fire questions in, and then we have a different person monitor the chat. So you'd need someone to help you, because you can't really interview and monitor the chat, but you have someone else watching the chat. They can interject with the right questions, be like, oh, Sarah's asked this, Jack's asked that. That works really well for us, because people are more willing to fire into the chat than they are to go off mic. They don't know when to interrupt. They don't know, and hands up is a bit messy. So we find that chat gets really good engagement.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. Well, what I like to do is spot a good question in the chat, and then call on that person to unmute themselves and ask the question rather than me just read their question. But yeah, that's maybe I should encourage like more questions in the chat. And maybe
you set it up today by saying I've I've talked to 4 or 5 people ahead of time, and we're going to kind of go through their comments, and then you called on them. So I kind of was in a sit back and listen mode, which worked out great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Simon, I think a lot of people are in that sit back and listen mode. Some people maybe are eating lunch and listening or multitasking. I wouldn't put them on the spot. I don't think it's a problem. I think it works.
Okay, good. All right.
Do
Well, I'm glad
ahead of
to
time,
hear that.
Simon?
What's that?
Do you collect questions ahead of time as well? Or not?
No, but that's a good thing too, is like maybe when I send out the announcement, you know, like I did this week, maybe I'll say something like like leave your questions in the comment section that I can ask in the session, and I'll make sure to, you know, shout out your name and everything like that as well.
Yeah, and something that works really well, this works really well in Jay Klaus's community, and he's killer. He runs a podcast called Creative Elements, but they'll do like a hot seat once a month, like a 30-minute hot seat for someone who's experiencing either a particular problem. So it's kind of like one of your consulting calls, or like half hour of your consulting call, but live. And they'll say ahead of time like what that specific problem is, so people can come in and actually join in based on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe I'll also like have, you know, occasional office hours where people can just pepper me with questions. You know, since because I've been doing that with the Q&A versions of my newsletter, but I'm very limited in how many questions I can answer. So maybe something that's a little bit more rapid fire, I can, you know, answer reader questions and stuff like that. But anyway, well, thank you so much, everybody. Let me go ahead and end this recording. Oh no, not that. Sorry, I was about to accidentally end the whole thing. Stop recording.